Hey folks, I'm excited to share some stories with you today that I've written myself. Whether you're a long-time follower or just joining us, I'd love to hear your thoughts on these tales. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe if you're new here. Let's dive in, and I hope you enjoy. I sold my body to the scientists on the dark web. I want my money back. Hey everyone, I've never been one to share my personal life online, but what happened to me needs to be told. Maybe it'll serve as a warning to anyone tempted by easy money on the dark web. A couple of months ago, I was in a desperate situation. I was drowning in debt. My job wasn't paying enough, and my rent was overdue. I was scouring the internet for any way to make quick cash when I stumbled upon the dark web. I'd heard stories about it, but I never imagined I'd end up there myself. One night, fueled by desperation and a bit too much whiskey, I decided to explore. It wasn't long before I found a forum discussing ways to make money fast. That's when I saw it, a post titled, "Sell your body for science. Big money." At first, I laughed. It sounded like some kind of twisted joke, but as I read through the details, I realized it was serious. They were offering $50,000 for volunteers willing to undergo a series of experiments. The process seemed straightforward. Contact the poster, get the details, sign a contract, and show up at a specified location. The money would be paid up front. It seemed too good to be true, but I was desperate. I contacted the poster, and within minutes, I got a reply. They wanted to know if I was in good health, had any medical conditions, or any history of mental illness. I answered their questions, and they quickly approved me. The next morning, I received an email with an address and a date. It was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of a town. Sketchy, I know, but the promise of money was all I could think about. I showed up at the location, and sure enough, there was a guy waiting for me. He looked normal enough, mid-40s, glasses, a lab coat. He introduced himself as Dr. Gray. He handed me a contract, which I skimmed through. It was full of legal jargon, but the main points were clear. I was consenting to a series of experiments, and in return, I'd receive $50,000. I signed the contract without hesitation. Dr. Gray led me inside the warehouse. It was exactly what you'd expect, dilapidated, dark, and smelled like mold. We walked down a long hallway to a room filled with medical equipment. That's when I started to feel uneasy. The equipment looked old, almost ancient, and there were strange symbols carved into the walls. Dr. Gray noticed my hesitation and assured me everything was fine. "Just preliminary tests," he said. He asked me to lie down on a metal table. I did as he said, and he strapped me down. At this point, I was starting to panic, but before I could protest, he injected me with something. The world went dark. When I woke up, I was in a small, dimly lit room. My head was pounding, and my body ached. I tried to move, but I was still strapped to the table. Dr. Gray was there, along with two other men in lab coats. They were talking in hushed tones, but I could hear snippets of their conversation. Words like subject and ritual kept coming up. I struggled against the restraints, but it was no use. Dr. Gray noticed I was awake and walked over. "You're doing great," he said with a twisted smile. "The preliminary tests are complete. Now we can begin the real experiment." Before I could react, he injected me again, and I blacked out. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, I was in a different room. This one was even worse. It was dark, damp, and the walls were covered in those strange symbols. There were candles everywhere, casting eerie shadows. I was still strapped to the table, but I could move my head enough to see what was around me. That's when I noticed the other tables, each one occupied by someone like me, strapped down and unconscious. Dr. Gray and his assistants were moving around the room, preparing for something. I could hear chanting, low and rhythmic. It sent chills down my spine. Then the chanting stopped, and Dr. Gray approached me. He had a syringe in his hand, filled with a dark, thick liquid. "This is the final phase," he said. "You're going to help us unlock the secrets of the human mind." He injected the liquid into my arm, and the pain was immediate and excruciating. It felt like my veins were on fire. I screamed, but no sound came out. My vision blurred, and I felt like I was being pulled into a dark abyss. The last thing I remember before passing out was Dr. Gray's face, twisted into a look of pure malevolence. When I woke up, I was back in the small room. My body was covered in strange markings, and I felt different, like something inside me had changed. The pain was gone, but there was a lingering sense of dread. Dr. Gray was there, watching me with a satisfied look on his face. "It's done," he said. "You've been a perfect subject." He handed me a bag filled with cash and unstrapped me from the table. "You're free to go," he said. I stumbled out of the warehouse, barely able to walk. I made my way home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The markings on my body wouldn't fade, no matter how much I scrubbed. And then the nightmares started. Horrible, vivid dreams of rituals and dark figures. I tried to forget about it, to move on with my life, but it was impossible. The money was sitting in my apartment, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. It felt tainted. I started to notice strange things happening around me, objects moving on their own, whispers in the dark, and shadows that didn't belong. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. All I knew was that I had made a terrible mistake, and I had to find a way to undo it. That's when I decided to go back to the warehouse. I had to confront Dr. Gray and find out what he had done to me. But what I found there was far worse than anything I could have imagined. Returning to the warehouse was a decision born out of desperation. I knew something was wrong with me, something beyond the physical. I had hoped that confronting Dr. Gray would provide answers, or maybe even a solution. But as I approached the decrepit building, dread settled in the pit of my stomach. The place looked even more abandoned than before. The windows were shattered, and the door hung ajar, creaking in the wind. I stepped inside, the smell of decay overwhelming. The long hallway seemed darker, more foreboding. I followed it back to the room where everything had started. The room was empty, but the strange symbols were still etched into the walls, glowing faintly in the dim light. I called out for Dr. Gray, my voice echoing eerily. No response. I explored further, moving into the other rooms. That's when I found it. A hidden door at the back of the main room, slightly ajar. Behind it was a staircase leading down into darkness. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I forced myself to descend. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint chanting I had heard before returned, growing louder as I approached the bottom. I reached a dimly lit chamber, larger than any of the rooms above. The walls were covered in strange symbols, some of which seemed to writhe and shift as I looked at them. Candles lined the floor in intricate patterns, their flames flickering unnaturally In the center of the room was an altar, and on it lay an unconscious figure. As I drew closer, I realized it was one of the other subjects I had seen before. They were pale and motionless, covered in the same markings that adorned my body. Surrounding the altar were Dr. Gray and his assistants, chanting in a language that made my skin crawl. I hid in the shadows, watching as they performed their ritual. Dr. Gray held a large, ancient-looking book, reading from it in that same eerie language. His voice echoed unnaturally, reverberating through the chamber. The air grew heavy, and a palpable sense of dread filled the room. Suddenly, the figure on the altar began to convulse, their body arching unnaturally. The chanting grew louder, more intense. Dr. Gray raised a dagger, its blade glinting in the candlelight, and plunged it into the subject's chest. Blood poured out, but instead of pooling on the altar, it seemed to be absorbed by the markings on their skin, which began to glow a deep, malevolent red. I couldn't watch anymore. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This wasn't just some twisted experiment. It was something far darker, something evil. I turned to leave, but my foot caught on a loose stone, and I fell hard. The noise drew their attention. The chanting stopped abruptly, and all eyes turned towards me. Dr. Gray's face twisted into a snarl. "You were supposed to be gone," he hissed, stepping towards me. "This doesn't concern you anymore." I scrambled to my feet and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear them following, their footsteps echoing behind me. I reached the stairs and sprinted up, not daring to look back. I burst out of the warehouse and into the night, not stopping until I was far away. Back at my apartment, I locked the door and collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. My body ached, and the markings burned painfully. The whispering was louder now, filling my head with incomprehensible words. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to find help. I went online, searching for anything that might explain what was happening to me. I found forums discussing occult rituals and dark magic, but nothing concrete. Then I remembered a professor from my college days, someone who had taught a course on ancient religions and the occult. He might know something. I reached out to him, explaining my situation as best I could without sounding completely insane. To my surprise, he agreed to meet with me. I packed a bag, grabbed the cursed money, and left my apartment, hoping he could provide some answers. When I arrived at his office, he looked concerned. "You've gotten yourself into something very dangerous," he said after I told him everything. He examined the markings on my body, his face growing more serious. "These symbols are part of an ancient ritual. They're used to bind a person's soul to a demonic entity." My blood ran cold. "Is there any way to undo it?" I asked, desperation in my voice. He nodded slowly. "There might be, but it won't be easy. We'll need to perform a counter ritual, something that can sever the connection. It's risky, but it's your only chance." He gave me a list of items to gather, most of which were strange and obscure. I spent the next few days tracking them down, all the while feeling the presence of something dark and malevolent growing stronger inside me. The whispering was constant now, filling my mind with terrifying images and thoughts. Finally, I had everything I needed. We met in a secluded spot outside of town, far from prying eyes. The professor set up a circle of candles and drew intricate symbols on the ground. He instructed me to stand in the center and began to chant, his voice steady and calm. As the ritual progressed, I felt a searing pain in my chest, like something was being ripped out of me. The markings on my skin glowed fiercely, and I could feel the dark presence fighting to stay. The professor continued to chant, his voice growing louder, more insistent. The pain intensified, and I screamed, collapsing to my knees. Then suddenly, it was over. The pain stopped, and the markings faded. I felt different, lighter, free. The professor helped me to my feet, a relieved smile on his face. "It's done," he said. "You're free." I thanked him profusely and left, feeling a sense of relief and gratitude. But as I made my way home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, waiting. I thought the nightmare was over after the professor's ritual, but I couldn't have been more wrong. The sense of relief I felt was fleeting, and the ominous presence never truly left. It was subtle at first, shadows shifting in the corner of my vision, strange noises in my apartment at night, and the occasional whisper that I tried to dismiss as my imagination. A few days later, I woke up to find a small black mark on my arm. It looked like a burn, but I had no memory of how it got there. As the days passed, more marks appeared, each one more painful than the last. The professor assured me that the ritual had worked, but I could tell he was worried. He suggested I keep a low profile and avoid anything related to the dark web or the occult. I tried to follow his advice, but it wasn't long before the situation escalated. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from my closet. My heart pounded as I got up to investigate, expecting to find nothing but empty clothes hangers. Instead, I was met with a sight that chilled me to the bone. The inside of my closet door was covered in those same strange symbols, drawn in what looked like dried blood. I stumbled back, my mind racing. How had this happened? I hadn't been anywhere near the warehouse since the ritual, and no one else had access to my apartment. Panic set in as I realized the dark presence was still with me, and it was growing stronger. I called the professor immediately, my voice shaking as I explained what I had found. He arrived within the hour, his face grim. After examining the symbols, he confirmed my worst fear. "It seems the ritual only severed part of the connection," he said. "Whatever entity was bound to you is still trying to reclaim its hold." He proposed another solution, a final desperate attempt to rid myself of this curse. We needed to perform a more powerful ritual, one that would banish the entity for good. The problem was, it required an ancient artifact, a talisman that was said to be hidden in a remote, uncharted area, known for its history of occult activity. Without hesitation, I agreed. The thought of living with this malevolent force inside me was unbearable. We prepared for the journey, gathering supplies and information about the location. The professor warned me that this would be dangerous, but I was beyond caring. I just wanted my life back. We set out early the next morning, driving for hours until we reached the outskirts of a dense forest. According to the professor, the talisman was hidden in an abandoned temple deep within the woods. As we hiked through the forest, an uneasy feeling settled over me. The air was thick with an unnatural silence, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. After hours of trekking, we finally reached the temple. It was an ancient, crumbling structure covered in vines and moss. The entrance was blocked by a heavy stone door, but with considerable effort, we managed to push it open. Inside, the air was musty and stale, and the only light came from our flashlights. The professor led the way, navigating the narrow, winding corridors with a map he had acquired from a trusted source. We reached a large chamber, the walls covered in faded murals depicting dark rituals and sacrifices. In the center of the room was an altar, and upon it lay the talisman, a small, intricately carved amulet that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie glow. As we approached the altar, a sense of dread washed over me. The air grew colder, and I could hear faint whispers, just like before. The professor reached out to take the talisman, but as soon as his fingers touched it, the ground shook violently, and a deafening roar filled the chamber. The walls began to crack, and the murals seemed to come to life, their figures writhing and contorting in agony. The professor grabbed the talisman and shoved it into my hands. "We need to get out of here now," he shouted over the noise. We ran back through the corridors, the temple collapsing around us. Just as we reached the entrance, the ceiling caved in behind us, sealing the chamber for good. We stumbled out into the forest, gasping for breath. The talisman felt warm in my hand, and I could feel its power resonating through me. Back at the professor's office, we prepared for the final ritual. He drew a large circle on the floor, filling it with intricate symbols and placing candles at strategic points. I stood in the center, clutching the talisman, as he began to chant. The air grew thick with energy, and I could feel the dark presence within me stirring, resisting. The professor's voice grew louder, more insistent, as the talisman began to glow brighter. Pain shot through my body, but I forced myself to stay upright, focusing on the talisman's warmth. The whispers grew louder, turning into screams. My vision blurred, and I felt like I was being torn apart from the inside. Then with a final piercing scream, the presence was ripped from me. I collapsed to the floor, the talisman shattering in my hand. When I came to, the professor was kneeling beside me, a relieved look on his face. "It's over," he said. "The entity is gone for good." I should have felt relieved, but as I looked around, I realized the room was filled with shadows, darker and more menacing than before. The symbols on the floor had changed, morphing into something sinister. The professor's face twisted into a cruel smile. "You really thought it would be that easy?" he hissed, his voice taking on a malevolent tone. The realization hit me like a truck. The professor had been part of the cult all along, using me to fulfill some dark agenda. Before I could react, the shadows enveloped me, and everything went black. When I regained consciousness, I found myself in a pitch-black room, the air heavy with the stench of decay. My hands were bound, and I could feel the rough texture of the ropes digging into my wrists. Panic set in as I struggled against the restraints, but they held firm. A single door creaked open, flooding the room with a dim, flickering light. The professor stepped inside, his face twisted into a cruel grin. "Welcome back," he said mockingly. "I've been waiting for you to wake up." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and raw. All I managed was a hoarse croak. He walked over, grabbing my chin and forcing me to look at him. "You've been quite the valuable subject," he sneered, "but you're not done yet." He released my chin and stepped back, revealing a group of robed figures standing behind him. Their faces were hidden in the shadows, but their presence sent a chill down my spine. The professor turned to them and began to speak in that same eerie language I had heard before. The robed figures moved closer, their hands reaching out to touch me. As their fingers brushed against my skin, a searing pain shot through my body. I screamed, but they didn't stop. They began to chant, their voices rising in a sinister harmony. The symbols on my body burned like fire, and I could feel something dark and malevolent stirring within me. It was as if the entity they had tried to bind to me before was being summoned back, more powerful than ever. My vision blurred, and I felt like I was being pulled into a void. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, the chanting stopped, and the pain subsided. I slumped forward, gasping for breath. The professor stepped closer, holding the shattered pieces of the talisman. "This," he said, "is the key to unlocking your true potential." He placed the fragments on an altar in the center of the room, arranging them in a specific pattern. The robed figures began to chant again, and the fragments started to glow with an otherworldly light. The air grew thick with energy, and I could feel the dark presence within me growing stronger. The professor turned to me, his eyes gleaming with malevolent excitement. "You see, the ritual was never meant to free you," he said. "It was meant to complete the binding. With this final step, you will become the vessel for our master." My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the full extent of their plan. They had used me from the beginning, manipulating me into becoming the perfect host for whatever dark entity they served. I had to find a way out, but my body was weak and the ropes held firm. As the chanting reached a fever pitch, the fragments on the altar fused together, forming a single pulsating mass. The professor raised his hands, and the mass floated into the air, hovering above me. I could feel its energy, dark and oppressive, pressing down on me. Desperation gave me strength. I struggled against the ropes, my mind racing for a plan. The mass descended slowly, its energy growing more intense. I knew I had only moments before it would merge with me completely. In a final, desperate act, I focused all my remaining strength on the markings that covered my body. I remembered the professor's earlier ritual, the one that had temporarily severed the connection. I tried to recall the symbols and the words he had used, muttering them under my breath. To my surprise, the markings on my skin began to glow faintly, responding to my efforts. The robed figures noticed and tried to stop me, but it was too late. The energy from the markings surged, pushing back against the dark presence. The mass above me trembled, its pulsating light flickering. The professor's expression changed from triumph to panic. "No!" he shouted, lunging towards me. But the energy from the markings exploded outward, creating a barrier between us. The robed figures were thrown back, and the mass disintegrated into nothingness. The markings on my skin faded, and the oppressive energy dissipated. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but free. The professor screamed in rage, but I didn't stay to listen. I struggled to my feet, my legs barely supporting me, and stumbled towards the door. The robed figures were disoriented, giving me just enough time to escape. I ran through the dark corridors, my mind focused on one thing: getting out alive. The building shook, as if it were collapsing around me, but I didn't stop. I burst through the exit and into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap. I didn't stop running until I was far away, the sounds of the collapsing building fading into the distance. I finally collapsed in an alley, my body shaking with exhaustion and relief. I had escaped, but I knew it wasn't over. The professor and his cult were still out there, and the dark presence they served would stop at nothing to reclaim me. I had to stay hidden, to find a way to protect myself. As I lay there, catching my breath, I made a vow. I would find a way to end this, to destroy the cult and the dark entity once and for all. I would not let them win. The weeks that followed my escape were a blur of paranoia and constant movement. I never stayed in one place for too long, always looking over my shoulder, always wary of shadows that seemed to creep closer. I knew the professor and his cult wouldn't give up easily, and the dark presence that had once been inside me was still out there, searching. I couldn't go back to my old life. I had to stay under the radar, find a way to end this once and for all. I reached out to a few contacts I had made in the occult community, hoping to find someone who could help me. Most were too scared or unwilling to get involved, but one name kept coming up: Father Gabriel. Father Gabriel was a priest known for his work in exorcisms and battling dark forces. It took some time, but I eventually tracked him down to a small church on the outskirts of a rural town. When I arrived, I was a mess, disheveled, exhausted, and desperate. He welcomed me in, his eyes filled with understanding and compassion. I told him everything, from the initial experiment to the professor's betrayal and the ongoing threat. He listened patiently, then nodded. "You're dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple haunting or possession," he said. "This is a battle for your soul, and it won't end until the entity is completely banished." Father Gabriel agreed to help me, but warned that the process would be perilous. We needed to perform a final, decisive ritual to sever the entity's hold on me and destroy the cult. He began preparations, gathering ancient texts, holy artifacts, and protective wards. The ritual would take place in the church, a place sanctified and protected by centuries of faith. Father Gabriel spent days preparing the sanctuary, drawing intricate symbols on the floor and walls, setting up candles, and placing sacred objects at key points. He taught me the chants and prayers I would need to recite, explaining that my participation was crucial. The night of the ritual, the air was thick with tension. Father Gabriel and I stood in the center of the sanctuary, surrounded by candles that cast flickering shadows on the walls. He began to chant, his voice strong and steady, filling the room with a sense of calm and power. I joined in, repeating the words he had taught me, my voice shaky but determined. As the ritual progressed, I could feel the dark presence growing stronger, pushing back against the protective wards. The air grew cold, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe. The candles flickered wildly, their flames struggling to stay lit. Suddenly, the doors of the church burst open, and the professor and his cult stormed in. Their faces were twisted with rage and determination. "You cannot escape us," the professor shouted. "Your soul belongs to our master." Father Gabriel didn't falter. He raised a crucifix, his voice rising above the chaos. "Begone, servants of darkness. You have no power here." The cult members recoiled, their advance halted by an invisible barrier. The professor snarled, raising a hand to summon the dark entity. A shadowy figure materialized in the center of the sanctuary, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. The markings on my body flared with pain, and I struggled to keep chanting. Father Gabriel placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "Stay strong," he said. "We're almost there." He intensified his chants, the power of his words pushing back against the entity. The shadowy figure writhed, its form flickering as if caught between two worlds. The cult members screamed, their bodies convulsing as the dark energy was drawn away from them. The professor's face twisted in agony, but he continued to fight, his eyes filled with hatred. With a final, powerful incantation, Father Gabriel thrust the crucifix towards the entity, There was a blinding flash of light, and the shadowy figure let out a deafening roar. The room shook, and I felt a surge of energy pass through me. The dark presence was ripped away, its hold on me shattered. The light faded, and the sanctuary fell silent. The cult members lay unconscious, their connection to the dark entity severed. The professor was nowhere to be seen, his body having been consumed by the very force he had sought to control. I collapsed to the floor, my body shaking with relief and exhaustion. Father Gabriel knelt beside me, a look of triumph on his face. "It's over," he said softly. "You're free." The marks on my body had faded, leaving only faint scars as a reminder of what I had endured. The church was filled with an eerie calm, the oppressive darkness replaced by a sense of peace. I knew that the battle had been won, but the war was far from over. In the days that followed, Father Gabriel helped me rebuild my life. He taught me how to protect myself from future threats and provided me with the resources to start anew. I left the town with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to use my experience to help others facing similar dangers. The dark web and the cult may still be out there, lurking in the shadows, but I was no longer their victim. I had faced the darkness and survived, and I would do everything in my power to ensure that others wouldn't fall into the same trap. As I moved forward, I knew that my journey wasn't over. The scars I carried were a testament to the horrors I had faced, but they were also a symbol of my strength and resilience. No matter what lay ahead, I was ready to face it head on. My friend ordered an unidentified animal species from the dark web. I wish I never let him do it. I don't even know why I'm writing this. Maybe it's because I need to warn someone, anyone, about what I saw, what happened to my friend Dave, and what's probably going to happen to me. Dave and I have been friends since high school. We've always been into weird shit. Creepy pastas, horror movies, haunted houses. But Dave was the type who always wanted more, to go further. He wanted to experience fear in a way that was real. It was his obsession with the dark web that started it all. It was a regular Friday night. We were hanging out at his apartment, drinking beers, and watching some low-budget horror movie when Dave started talking about something he found on the dark web. Now, I'm no stranger to the dark web. I've seen my share of messed up stuff on there, but I always knew where to draw the line. Dave, though, he didn't have a line. "Hey man, check this out," Dave said, pulling out his laptop. He navigated through a series of encrypted sites and eventually landed on one that looked like some sort of marketplace. It was full of all kinds of illegal crap. Drugs, weapons, you name it. But Dave was focused on one specific listing: unidentified animal species. The description was vague, almost like it was written by someone who didn't speak English as their first language. It promised an animal never seen before, guaranteed to be the ultimate pet for thrill seekers. The price was outrageous, but Dave didn't care. He was already reaching for his wallet. "Dude, don't you think this is a bad idea?" I asked, feeling a knot forming in my stomach. "We don't even know what this thing is." "That's the point," Dave replied, his eyes lighting up with excitement. "This could be the craziest thing we've ever done." I should have stopped him. I should have done something more than just voice my concern, but I didn't. I let him place the order, and that was the beginning of the nightmare. A week later, A plain, unmarked crate arrived at Dave's apartment. It was surprisingly small, considering it was supposed to contain some kind of exotic animal. Dave was practically bouncing with excitement as he opened it. I stood back, a growing sense of dread gnawing at me. Inside the crate was a metal cage, and inside the cage was, well, at first I couldn't tell what it was. It was small, about the size of a cat, and covered in thick matted fur. Its eyes were enormous and almost completely black, reflecting the dim light of the apartment like twin pools of oil. It had long, spindly legs and a mouth full of sharp, needle-like teeth. The smell it emitted was like a combination of rotting meat and ammonia, so strong it made my eyes water. "What the hell is that thing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Dave replied, a manic grin spreading across his face. "But isn't it amazing?" I wanted to tell him, no, it wasn't amazing. It was horrifying. But Dave was already obsessed. He spent the next few hours setting up a makeshift habitat for the creature, which he decided to name Nox, after some demon from a video game we used to play. Nox didn't act like any animal I'd ever seen. It didn't eat the food Dave gave it, didn't respond to any kind of stimuli. It just sat in its cage, staring at us with those pitch black eyes and making a low, almost imperceptible hissing sound. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I tried to talk to Dave about it, but he brushed me off, saying I was just being paranoid. I left his apartment that night with a sense of foreboding, but I never could have imagined the true horror that was yet to come. I didn't hear from Dave for a few days after that. I figured he was just busy with work or something. Then one night, I got a call from him. He sounded frantic, panicked. He kept saying that Nox was acting strange, that it was making weird noises, and that he didn't know what to do. "Calm down, man. I'll be right over," I said, trying to soothe him. When I arrived at Dave's apartment, the place was a wreck. Furniture was overturned. There were deep scratches on the walls, and the smell, oh God, the smell, was unbearable. It was like the scent of decay had permeated every inch of the place. "Dave, where are you?" I called out, my heart pounding in my chest. No response. I made my way through the apartment, my footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. When I reached Dave's bedroom, I found the door closed. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. The sight that greeted me will haunt me for the rest of my life. The cage was open, and Nox was nowhere to be seen. The room was in shambles, and in the middle of the floor was a large, dark stain. I forced myself to look closer and realized with a sickening jolt that it was blood. "Dave?" I called out again, my voice trembling. I heard a faint rustling sound coming from the closet. I approached it slowly, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. I threw the door open and found Dave curled up inside, his eyes wide with terror. "Jesus, Dave, what happened?" I asked, reaching out to help him up. He looked at me with a wild, desperate expression. "It's not an animal," he whispered. "It's a monster." Before I could react, something dark and fast darted out from behind the clothes and latched onto Dave. He screamed, a blood-curdling sound that echoed through the apartment. I tried to pull the creature off him, but it was too strong. It sunk its teeth into his neck, and the sound of flesh tearing filled the room. I stumbled back, horrified, as Dave's screams turned into gurgles. The last thing I saw before I bolted from the apartment was Nox's black eyes staring at me, a predatory glint in their depths. I ran as fast as I could, my mind a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. I don't know how I made it home, but when I did, I locked all the doors and windows, praying that whatever Knox was, it wouldn't find me. I haven't slept in days. I keep hearing Dave's screams, seeing Knox's eyes in the darkness. And now, as I write this, I hear scratching at my door. It's only a matter of time before it finds me. If you're reading this, please, stay away from the dark web. Some things are better left unknown. I can't explain the feeling of dread that settled over me after I escaped Dave's apartment. It was like a dark cloud that followed me everywhere I went, suffocating me. I could still hear Dave's screams echoing in my ears, see the lifeless look in his eyes as Knox tore into him. I couldn't go to the police. What would I say? That my friend bought a monster off the dark web and it killed him? They'd think I was crazy. The days passed in a blur. I barely slept, jumping at every sound, every shadow. I knew Knox was out there, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it came for me. I spent hours scouring the internet, trying to find any information about creatures like Knox, but there was nothing. No mention of an animal with black eyes and needle-like teeth. No reports of similar attacks. It was as if Knox didn't exist, except in my nightmares. Then one night, I got a call from an unknown number. I hesitated before answering, my heart racing. "Hello?" I said, my voice trembling. "You're next," a voice whispered on the other end. It was distorted, like it was coming through a broken speaker, but I recognized it. It was Dave's voice. I dropped the phone, my blood turning to ice. This had to be a prank, some sick joke. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew Dave was dead, and somehow, Knox was using his voice to taunt me. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, like a rat in a maze with no way out. Every night, the scratching at my door got louder, more insistent. I barricaded myself in my bedroom, armed with a kitchen knife, but I knew it was futile. Knox was toying with me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Desperate, I reached out to a friend of mine, Alex, who was into all kinds of paranormal and cryptid stuff. If anyone could help me, it was him. "Dude, you sound like you've seen a ghost," Alex said when he answered my call. "What's going on?" I told him everything, from the dark web purchase to Dave's horrific death. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Holy shit," Alex finally said. "This is some next level stuff. I've never heard of anything like this before." "Can you help me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do what I can," he replied. "But you need to get out of there. Come stay with me for a few days. We'll figure something out." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed a few essentials, shoved them into a backpack, and bolted from my apartment. The entire time, I felt like I was being watched, like Knox was lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. When I arrived at Alex's place, I collapsed on the couch, exhausted but relieved to be somewhere safe. Alex handed me a beer and sat down next to me, his face serious. "We need to find out what the hell this thing is," he said. "I have some contacts in the paranormal community. Maybe they can help." Over the next few days, Alex and I scoured every source we could find, but we came up empty-handed. There were plenty of stories about strange creatures and dark web horrors, but nothing that matched Knox. It was like it was one of a kind, something that shouldn't exist in our world. Then one night, Alex woke me up, his face pale. "I found something," he said, holding up his phone. "There's a guy, goes by the name of Dr. Khan. He's an expert on cryptids and supernatural entities. If anyone knows what Nox is, it's him. We contacted Dr. Khan and arranged a meeting. He was an eccentric old man with wild hair and a piercing gaze that seemed to look right through you. He listened intently as I told him my story, his expression growing darker with each word. "This is worse than I thought," he said when I finished. "Nox is not an animal. It's a creature from another dimension, a predator that feeds on fear and suffering. It uses the dark web to find its victims, drawn to those who seek out the unknown." "How do we stop it?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "There is no stopping it," Dr. Khan replied grimly. "Once it has marked you, it will not stop until it has consumed you. The only thing you can do is run, but even that may not save you." His words were like a death sentence. I felt the weight of hopelessness settle over me, crushing any remaining shred of hope. But I couldn't give up. I couldn't just wait for Nox to find me and do to me what it did to Dave. "We have to try," I said, my voice firm. "There has to be a way to fight back." Dr. Khan studied me for a moment, then nodded. "There is one possibility," he said, "but it is dangerous and may not work." "I'll do anything," I replied without hesitation. He handed me a small vial of liquid, its contents glowing faintly. "This is a potion made from a rare herb that can temporarily banish Nox back to its own dimension, but it is incredibly potent and must be used with caution. If you drink too much, it could kill you." I took the vial, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. "Thank you," I said, clutching it tightly. "Be careful," Dr. Khan warned. "And remember, Nox is a master of deception. It will do anything to break you." I nodded, my resolve hardening. I had to be ready. I had to survive. But deep down, I knew the worst was yet to come. Leaving Dr. Khan's place with the vial of glowing liquid, I felt a mix of hope and dread. Alex and I returned to his apartment, our nerves on edge. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses down on you, making every little sound seem amplified. "Are you sure about this?" Alex asked, his voice tinged with concern as we sat in his living room. "Do I have a choice?" I replied, clutching the vial. "We can't just wait for Nox to come and get me. We have to take the fight to it." We spent the next few hours preparing. Alex rigged up some makeshift defenses, salt lines across the doors and windows, iron nails, anything we could think of that might help. I kept the vial close, its faint glow a constant reminder of what we were up against. As midnight approached, the atmosphere grew tense. The shadows seemed to deepen, the air growing colder. I could feel it, the oppressive presence of Nox drawing nearer. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins. Then the scratching started, faint at first, like nails on a chalkboard, growing louder and more insistent. It was coming from the door, the same sound I'd heard at my apartment. Alex and I exchanged a glance, both of us pale with fear. "It's here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Get ready," I said, gripping the vial tightly. The scratching intensified, becoming a frantic scraping, as if Nox was desperate to get inside. The door rattled, the handle turning slowly. I could see the salt line trembling, the barrier holding, but only just. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, and the door flew open. The salt line scattered, and Nox slithered into the room. It was even more horrifying than I remembered. Its black eyes gleamed with malevolent intelligence, and its needle-like teeth glistened in the dim light. "Now!" I shouted, uncorking the vial and downing the contents in one gulp. The liquid burned as it went down, a fiery sensation spreading through my body. I could feel it working, a strange energy coursing through me. Nox hesitated, sensing the change. It hissed, a sound that sent chills down my spine, and then lunged at me. I held up my hand, the energy from the potion flowing through me, and Nox recoiled, shrieking in pain. The creature writhed, its form flickering, as if it was caught between dimensions. I could see the struggle in its eyes, the desperation. It wasn't going to give up easily. "Stay back," Alex shouted, throwing a handful of salt at Nox. The creature screeched, retreating slightly, but it wasn't enough to drive it away. I focused, channeling the energy from the potion. "Go back to where you came from," I yelled, my voice echoing through the room. "You don't belong here," Nox howled, its body contorting as if being pulled by an invisible force. I could see the strain on its face, the fight it was putting up, but slowly, inch by inch, it was being dragged backwards toward the door. Just when I thought we might actually win, Nox lashed out one last time, its claws raking across my chest. I cried out in pain, stumbling back. The distraction was enough for Nox to break free of the potion's influence. It lunged at me again, its eyes burning with rage. But before it could reach me, Alex stepped in, swinging a heavy iron skillet. The impact sent Nox flying across the room, its body slamming into the wall with a sickening thud. The creature lay there, stunned, giving me just enough time to regain my footing. I raised my hand again, summoning the last of the potion's power. "Go back!" I screamed, pouring all my fear and anger into the command. Nox convulsed, its form flickering violently. With one final agonized shriek, it was sucked into a dark vortex that appeared out of nowhere, and then it was gone. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting. Alex and I stood there, panting, our hearts racing. The marks on my chest burned, but I was alive. We had done it. We had banished Nox, but the victory felt hollow. Dave was still dead, and I knew that even though we had driven Nox away, it wasn't gone for good. It would find a way back, and when it did, it would be even more determined to finish what it started. "Are you okay?" Alex asked, his voice shaking. "I will be," I replied, wincing as I touched the wounds on my chest. "But this isn't over. Nox will come back." Alex nodded, his expression grim. "Then we'll be ready." We spent the rest of the night cleaning up, fortifying Alex's apartment even more. I knew it was only a temporary solution, but it was the best we could do. As the first light of dawn broke through the windows, I felt a strange sense of calm. We had faced Nox and survived. For now, that was enough. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Nox was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. And next time, it wouldn't be so easily defeated. The days following our confrontation with Nox were a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. Alex and I took turns sleeping, always keeping watch, always listening for any signs of Nox's return. Every creak, every rustle of leaves outside set our nerves on edge. Dr. Khan had warned us that Nox would come back, stronger and angrier. We needed to find a permanent solution, something that would rid us of the creature for good. Alex spent hours on his laptop, diving deeper into the dark web, trying to find any clue, any hint of information that might help us. Then one night, Alex came to me with a grim look on his face. "I found something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We huddled over his laptop, staring at a forum post buried deep in a dark web cryptid community. The post was from someone claiming to have survived an encounter with a creature that sounded eerily similar to Nox. The user, Darkseeker88, described a ritual that could banish the creature permanently, but it was dangerous and required specific, rare ingredients. "It's our best shot," Alex said, his eyes reflecting the desperation I felt. We spent the next few days gathering the items we needed. The list was bizarre. A silver dagger, a jar of salt from a consecrated ground, a black candle made from tallow, and the heart of a creature killed by the full moon's light. The last item was the hardest to find, but we managed to track down a local hunter who had taken down a deer during a recent full moon. The ritual had to be performed at midnight, at the place where the creature first manifested, in this case, Dave's apartment. The thought of returning there sent chills down my spine, but I knew we had no choice. As the day of the ritual approached, the atmosphere grew even tenser. The scratching at the doors and windows started again, more insistent and frantic. Nox was getting closer, its presence a constant shadow over our lives. On the night of the ritual, we packed everything into Alex's car and drove to Dave's apartment. The place had been left untouched since that horrific night. The air was thick with the stench of decay and something else, something darker. We set up the ritual in the living room, the spot where Nox had first appeared. The black candle cast eerie shadows on the walls, flickering ominously. Alex drew a circle of salt around us, muttering prayers under his breath. "Are you ready?" he asked, holding the silver dagger in one hand and the jar of salt in the other. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. We began the ritual, chanting the ancient words we had found. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening. I could feel Nox's presence, lurking just beyond the circle, watching us with those malevolent black eyes. As we continued the chant, a low growl filled the room. Nox materialized in the shadows, its form flickering in and out of focus. It lunged at the circle, but the salt held, repelling it with a hiss. "Keep going," Alex shouted, his voice straining with effort. I poured all my focus into the chant, the words flowing from my lips in a desperate plea. Nox howled, its body contorting as it fought against the ritual's power. The black candle flickered wildly, the flame threatening to go out. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of light, and the room shook violently. Nox let out a final, agonized scream as it was pulled into the vortex that opened beneath it. The force of the banishment knocked us off our feet, and everything went dark. When I came to, the apartment was silent. The air felt lighter, the oppressive presence of Nox gone. Alex was lying next to me, breathing heavily, but alive. "Did we do it?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Alex nodded weakly. "I think so. It's gone." We sat there for a moment, letting the reality of our victory sink in. The nightmare was over. We had banished Nox, and it wasn't coming back, or so we thought. As we cleaned up the ritual site, I noticed something strange. The black candle, which had burned down almost to the base, had a flickering flame, but it wasn't just a normal flame. It was a deep, dark blue, almost black. I reached out to touch it, but Alex grabbed my hand. "Don't," he warned, his voice filled with a new kind of fear. "What is it?" I asked, my heart sinking. "I don't know," Alex replied, staring at the flame. "But I don't think this is over." We snuffed out the candle, but the unease lingered. We left Dave's apartment, hoping that we had truly banished Nox. but the nagging feeling that something was still wrong followed us. Back at Alex's place, we tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. The days passed without incident, but the sense of dread never fully disappeared. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had merely delayed the inevitable, that Knox was still out there, waiting for the perfect moment to return. And then, one night, I woke up to the sound of scratching at my bedroom door. The sound of scratching at my bedroom door jolted me awake, sending a wave of terror through my body. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, frozen, listening to the insistent noise. It was Knox. It had found me. I reached for my phone and texted Alex. "It's here. What do I do?" His reply was immediate. "Don't open the door. I'm coming." I could hear the scratching growing louder, more frantic. It was as if Knox was taunting me, letting me know that no matter what we did, it would never truly be gone. I clutched the silver dagger we had used in the ritual, hoping it would offer some protection. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for Alex. The scratching turned into banging, the door rattling on its hinges. I backed away, my eyes locked on the door, ready to fight for my life. Finally, I heard Alex's car pull up outside. He burst into the house, carrying a bundle of supplies and looking more determined than I had ever seen him. "We're going to end this once and for all," he said, setting up the items around my room. He lit another black candle, drew a fresh circle of salt, and began chanting the banishment spell we had used before. Knox howled from the other side of the door, its voice filled with rage. The door began to splinter, cracks forming as the creature pounded against it. I joined Alex in the chant, our voices blending in a desperate plea to banish the monster once and for all. The room grew colder, the air thick with the stench of decay. The shadows seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting as Knox fought against the ritual's power. The door finally gave way, and Knox burst into the room, its black eyes blazing with fury. But this time, we were ready. The circle of salt held strong, the black candle's flame burning brightly. Knox screeched, its body convulsing as it tried to break through the barrier. "Hold the line!" Alex shouted, his voice straining with effort. I focused all my energy on the chant, willing the creature to be banished back to its own dimension. Knox howled, its form flickering violently. The silver dagger in my hand glowed with an eerie light, and I knew what I had to do. With a final, desperate cry, I plunged the dagger into Knox's heart. The creature let out a blood-curdling scream, its body convulsing one last time before it was sucked into a swirling vortex that opened beneath it. The room shook, and then everything went still. The silence was deafening. Knox was gone, truly gone this time. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, the adrenaline draining from my body. Alex knelt beside me, his face pale but relieved. "We did it," he said, his voice shaky. "It's over." I wanted to believe him, but the memory of the black candle's flame haunted me. I looked over at it, expecting to see the dark blue flame, but it was gone. Only the melted wax remained, a pool of black on the floor. As we cleaned up the aftermath, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface of the dark forces at play. Knox was gone, but the dark web was still out there, full of horrors waiting to be unleashed. Alex and I vowed to stay vigilant, to be ready for whatever might come next. We had faced a nightmare and survived, but the scars would remain forever. The world was a darker place than we had ever imagined, and we knew that we could never let our guard down. That night, as I lay in bed, I finally allowed myself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, we had put an end to the terror. But deep down, I knew the truth. The dark web was a portal to places that should never be explored, and there would always be those who were curious enough to open the door. I drifted off to sleep, the shadows in my room seeming to shift and dance in the dim light. And somewhere in the deepest corners of my mind, I heard a faint, familiar scratching